Hello everyone and welcome to the first installment of what is going to be a complete guide to the Caro Kann defense. And over a series of several videos, all compiled into the same playlist, I'm going to be going over every line of the Caro Kann, everything you need to watch out for, everything that you should play from what I would recommend, basically to anybody below 2000 ELO. So I hope that that is probably the majority of you. And today we're going to be starting off with the move order of e4, c6, d4, d5, and knight c3 or knight d2, because for the purposes of this video, it makes absolutely no difference. So the only real viable move for black to play here is to take. Because if you don't take, you could play e6, and if white takes, then fantastic. You take with the e-pawn, you get your bishop out, but white is not going to take. White is just going to continue developing normally with moves like bishop d3, and all you've done is stunted your own development. A big reason in the Caro Kann that you start with c6 d5 rather than e6 d5 like in the French defense is because with c6 d5 you can get your bishop out before locking the pawn chain. So you don't really want to shoot yourself in the foot and play e6 for no reason. In some lines, yes, you will play e6 and lock the bishop in, but if you can, you want to keep the opportunity open to get the bishop outside of the pawn chain first and then play e6. So we are not going to be playing e6, we are going to be taking. That is my recommendation. I think the vast majority of people would agree with me on that. And white pretty much always takes on e4 now, with knight takes e4, and we will be exploring what happens there later on in this video. But before that, I want to introduce you to a rather venomous gambit line that you should know if you want to play the Caro Kann. By the way, apologies, I've got a bit of a cold, so I hope my voice doesn't sound too weird. And it's f3. And this is known as the Blackmar-Diemer gambit, if I am correct. I hope I am. And you can play moves like knight to f6 against this gambit and just give the pawn back. There's some interesting lines with e5, taking on d1, king takes, knight to g4, winning the pawn back because you're threatening knight to f2. So you can absolutely go for this line if you want to. You have my full blessing. White can't castle. White also has an isolated pawn. So it is definitely a viable strategy to do that. White can, however, take with the knight, and then you can't really do this line quite as well, because, I mean, if white takes, you do have queen to h4 and you win the game, but white just isn't going to take, whereas in the previous line here, e5, white can still play knight to f3, but after e takes d4, black is probably better. Again, this is going to be a very in-depth video series analyzing the Caro Kann. So you can definitely, in this position, after pawn to f3, you can go knight to f6. And let me just check on my database quickly, but I have a feeling that after knight to f6, yeah, most people after knight f6 take with the knight rather than taking with the pawn. So I would definitely recommend... Wait, no, sorry, I am incorrect. I'm incorrect. The majority of people do take with the pawn. And I think this is actually an interesting thing to note. With opening analysis like this, I think it's really important not only to analyze what the excuse me, what the computer recommends, but to see what people actually play, because the main line may not necessarily be defined by the top engine choices. The main line is going to be what people play the most, and the majority of the time that is the top engine choice, but not always, because here, pawn takes is by far the most popular move. And after e5, black has very, very good scores, and sometimes white does take. That's the second most popular move. We know what happens there. If queen takes, king takes, knight g4, you win back the pawn. And if knight takes, then you just take on e4 and you've won back the pawn. White can castle, but you have very good development. So, you can definitely go for that. Now, I will mention taking as well, because it is a little bit more ambitious, but you can choose either line here. So you can go knight f6, or you can take. If you take, after knight takes f3, you want to go knight to f6. Let me just bring that up on my database quickly, because this will make this a lot better quality. And the computer likes bishop d3, but in the vast majority of games, white goes bishop to c4, and this actually scores a lot better for white. H3 is actually, in this position, one of the best moves as well, but bishop c4 tends to get played the most. Here, if you want to play this line, again, you absolutely can, but you need to know this. You have to go bishop to f5. e6 is very tempting. A lot of people play e6 here, but it's too passive. You have to go bishop to f5, and after bishop to f5, the best move for white is bishop g5, where you will go e6 and probably follow it up with something like knight b to d7, something like castles. Okay, bishop e7, just breaking the pin, is also perfectly fine. But you basically want to get this structure with e6 and the bishop on f5. Again, getting the bishop outside of the pawn chain first. But most people in this position actually castle. 73% of games, castling is preferred, which is kind of crazy because it is not really a good move. e6 is the best move for black. Again, you want to build up this little formation with the bishop on f5 and the pawn on e6 in most circumstances. The point is, you want to blunt this bishop. You want to try and stop sacrifices on f7, weakening the e6 pawn. And you also, with the bishop on f5, want to not only block the f-file for the rook in some circumstances, but also, after a move like knight e5, which is the most popular move here, have the option to bring the bishop back to g6. Also, there's an interesting tactic here of bishop c2, and if queen c2, queen takes d4, winning the knight, but it's not actually that good. It's a bit too flashy. It's unnecessary. Bishop g6 just holds the game together very, very nicely. And from here on, black has winning percentages of over 60%. So I don't think you need to worry too much. You know, something like knight takes, pawn takes, you have a nice open file for your rook. White doesn't really have much of an attacking threat, you know. Bishop g5, you can go knight bd7, you can go bishop e7. Black's got a very easy game from here on out, up a pawn, and the attack has been stopped. So, again, with the Black-Ma-Dima gambit, which is pawn to f3 after pawn takes, instead of knight takes pawn to f3, you can go knight f6, and you will get this position a good amount of the time. Remember, after takes, you take the queen, and if the knight takes, you take the pawn. If the king takes, you bring the knight to fork f2 and e5. And regardless, you've got a pretty good position with black. If knight takes here, then it's not quite as simple. You should probably play something like knight bd7 and try and argue that the white pawn on f3 is rather silly looking. But that is the situation with pawn to f3. And now we're going to tackle the main line. Okay, so with f3 out of the way, let's tackle the main line with knight takes e4. And previously, I was actually playing knight d7 in this position, and you can definitely play knight d7. Bishop to f5 is the most common move, I believe, and a whole lot of people play it. That's kind of like the, I suppose, the old main line, you could say, but it has lost popularity recently. And I think, personally, I much prefer the move knight to f6. Now, this is arguably a little bit drawish, but I think it offers black the opportunity to go for a rather drawn position, but also offers some really interesting dynamic play, and actually quite a lot of things for white to watch out for. So, pretty much always white will take on f6. Some people do play knight to g3, which is just rather strange because h5 tries to play h4 to attack the knight and try and get the knight to go back to e2. h4 stops that, but I mean, I think this probably favors black just because from experience I found the h4 pawn is actually quite weak once white castles. If you can play something like bishop g4, e6, bishop e7, trying to hunt down the h4 pawn, and if a knight comes to f3 defending it, then you can try and pin that. Just an interesting side note, the computer really likes to move c5, so you absolutely can do that, just immediately going after the white center, since this knight was this knight was previously guarding the c5 square. And, I mean, if white takes, you can just exchange the queens, play e6, win this pawn back pretty easily. Something like b4, you just play a5 and try and undermine that. You know, c3. This structure is probably not going to last for too long. Something like bishop to e7 is probably fine. Maybe trying to play knight d5 and bishop to f6. Knight c6 is something that you probably want to avoid. Well, b5 is actually okay because you just go knight e5. So maybe that is a good idea to go knight to c6 and put pressure on the b4 pawn, trying to get bishop d2 played. Takes, knight d5. This is an interesting position for sure. I think if you get a position like that after d takes, c5, queen takes, and king takes, you can do a lot of different things. White will probably be able to hold on to this pawn for a relatively long amount of time if they really want to, but you will win it back, and you definitely have long-term advantages with the black pieces, because your king is going to be safer, the white king is going to be vulnerable on the d file, potentially to knights jumping in to attack the c2 and f2 squares. And also, if this b pawn comes forward, then this diagonal against the rook is just going to be pretty weak. I don't really get this position all that often, though, because the majority of people just take. Again, apologies if you don't want me exploring all these different sidelines, but I personally think that they're very important to know if you're going to play an opening, because you don't want to get caught out. You don't necessarily have to memorize everything, but if your opponent plays something strange that you've never seen before, you want to at least have an idea of the kinds of things you want to be playing against it. So here, e takes f6. You can play g takes, but it's just a bit strange. And I have had this position online and over the board a lot of times. And there's a lot of different plans that white can employ. There's something like bishop to c4, which happens a small amount of time. Bishop d6 is the main move for black, and white can continue to develop normally with moves like c3 or knight to e2. Queen e2 is relatively popular. If white gives this check, just block with the queen. If white ever trades queens, you can take with the king. I prefer to take with the bishop just so you can castle. And there's nothing really, really interesting going on in this position. You could argue white has a slight edge because black has a pair of doubled pawns. But realistically, it's an incredibly solid line, and you shouldn't really struggle too much with this as the black pieces. White doesn't have any major threats in this position, no major advantages, and at the end of the day, if you can come out of the opening with the black pieces with a pretty equal position, there's nothing to be too concerned about. That is the nature of the Caro Kann. Now, something I will note, and something to bear in mind, is that knight to f3 is almost always a bad move. Almost always a bad move. And you might be asking why. That looks like a really, really reasonable move. Why wouldn't you want to get the knight into the center? There's several reasons. Firstly, this pin with the bishop on g4 is very, very powerful because white can't bring a knight to d2 to support the knight, because that knight went to c3 or went to d2, and after takes, the knight takes on e4. Again, it doesn't matter if it went to d2 or c3, and then gets traded off on f6, right? That knight's gone. So this knight can only be supported by the bishop if white wants to break the pin. Now, you shouldn't go bishop to g4 straight away. You can, but I would recommend not doing it, because white does have the option of going bishop to e2 immediately. Bishop d6 is a better move, because if white goes bishop to e2 preemptively, then you just don't have to do this. You can just continue your plan, your other plans, and go, what on earth is your bishop doing on e2? That's really, really passive. So you want to kind of wait for white to put the bishop on d3 and then pin. Maybe not in this position, actually. Sorry, not in this position. Wait for white to castle. I've actually fallen for this quite a few times, because if you go for this too early, then if you retreat the bishop to h5, I believe white can just continue pushing you and can play something like bishop to e3, queen d2, and castle queenside, and white's got a head start on the kingside attack. So you should probably wait for white to castle, actually. So if you castle here, white castles, then go for it. If c3 is played instead, for example, rook e8 check, always a move that you want to play with the black pieces. Bishop e3 is the most popular way of defending. And there's always ideas like bishop to f4 to put pressure on this pinned piece. You can play f5, you are threatening f4, but you can also just, after castles, you can go f4, boot the bishop back. You can just support with g6, but normally if you can get the pawn to f4, you're doing something right. Bishop to d2, bishop to g4. This is just a very nice position for the black pieces. And I've had lots of games like this over the board where I just slowly build up small advantages over the board and kind of squeeze my opponent's king side. The queen can often find a way, which I've done many times in the past, by going through a5 to h5 to maneuver into the king side action. And a lot of the time, let's just say, I don't know, a3, queen to a5. A lot of the time, white will play c4, go, oh, that's a discovered attack. I'll go queen to h5 and go, yeah, that was kind of the idea, mate. And the computer tries to claim that this is okay for white. Personally, I think I would take the black pieces in this position, but hey, that's neither here nor there. So, okay, let's back up a few moves. Essentially, if the white knight goes to f3, wait for white to castle, and play bishop to g4. While you're waiting for white to castle, if the knight goes to f3, play moves like rook e8 check, play moves like knight to d7. The knight often maneuvers through f8 or through b6. And when the opportunity arises for when white castles, play bishop to g4. If white doesn't castle, or maybe plays h3 first, let's say rook e8, bishop f4, well, I suppose in this position you've got f5. Let's say he doesn't go c3. Let's say instead white goes for something like castles h3 to stop you from going bishop g4. Realistically, this is just a bit of a waste of time. The knight can also come to a6 to go to c7 to go to d5, which is another possibility, or go to a6 and b4 to harass the bishop. Again, the move bishop f4 is totally playable to put pressure on the bishop. Something like bishop f4, queen d2, queen e7, trying to pile up pressure. The computer actually just wants to sacrifice. Wait, is this a sacrifice of a pawn? Oh no, there's rook e1. Sorry, so it's not actually a sacrifice. But if somebody found king f1 in an actual game, that would be very, very impressive. Anyway, knight coming to f3, not great for white. So the best way for white to set up is essentially c3, bishop d3, knight e2, queen c2. That's the best setup. So again, knight f3, not good. If with the black pieces, sorry, the bishop comes to d6, the bishop goes to g4. If the knight goes to f3, the knight goes to d7. You castle, you play rook e8. Queen c7 is a good idea a lot of the time. Queen a5 is sometimes playable. Let's see what happens when white plays the proper setup. So something like c3. If c3 is played immediately, you can play bishop to f5 to try and challenge the bishop coming to d3. Because if the bishop goes to d3, you're very happy to trade that off. So realistically, white should probably play bishop to d3 first, although I'm actually not going to lie, I didn't even know that this was a thing. Somehow, I've just never clocked that after bishop d3, this pawn is just hanging. And obviously there's no check with a discovered attack. So after knight f3, queen d6, black is just up a pawn. So white has to go c3. And then after bishop to f5, you can stop this plan of bishop d3. How have I never known this? That's actually really crazy. So then if bishop c4, bishop d6, queen f3, queen d7, that's an odd looking move to me. I would much rather play bishop g6, but the computer doesn't seem impressed. This is a very strange line. Knight f3. Again, this knight on f3 isn't even that good anyway because it can't advance into g5 or e5 because of the f6 pawn. That's very interesting. And then the computer wants bishop to f5. Can I not just castle? Knight h4. Okay, I lose the bishop, but like, that's not the end of the world at all. You build a little pawn square, and this looks decent for black. The computer says that white has a plus 0.76 advantage, but I don't know how white is planning on actually converting that. So I mean, okay, you don't have to go bishop g6 if you don't want to. You can play queen to d7, and after, I don't know, bishop f4, you just get a nice trade, you castle, you're absolutely fine, nothing to worry about. I have learned something new today. I have learned something new, and I bet a lot of people who play this line haven't actually considered that before. So that's very interesting. So c3, go bishop to f5, stop bishop to d3. Very good to know. What else can white do? Well, we've explored bishop to c4, we've explored knight to f3. Let's explore bishop to e3. Not the best move, but we should probably start with bishop to d6, although bishop f5 stops bishop to d3. So the computer recommends bishop d6, but I'm not really a fan of this because white can get the exact construction that he wants with something like this. This kind of setup is exactly what white wants. So I'm going to recommend not doing that, not going bishop d6, and going bishop to f5. And if white offers the trade, you snap it off. I'm going to say you snap it off. Although you could actually go bishop to d6 if you want to, and be fancy with queen to a5 check. That's also absolutely fine. That is fine for both white and black. You're just winning the piece back, but your queen is on a nice and active square on f5, so that's probably a good thing. So stop white from going bishop d3, because regardless of what the computer says, I always get into the most trouble when I allow the bishop to d3 and the queen to c2. Let me just show you what happens if you don't stop it. If you don't stop it and you have something like this happen, this is incredibly uncomfortable. The computer says, oh, it's only plus 0.2 or plus 0.15. Practically, this is really, really difficult. I can tell you from experience, this is very, very difficult. Don't do it. Just don't allow it. White can just castle queenside and start lobbing pawns at you. I have horrible success rates in this particular type of position. So don't do it. Don't allow it. Just go bishop to f5. And after bishop d3, just take. If you want to be fancy, yes, you can go bishop d6 and play this funny little queen check on a5. But there's no need to. You can just take if you want to. And then from here, you just play the normal move, something like bishop to d6. If white wants to trade the queens, you can trade the queens. If you want to avoid a trade of queens, you can go queen to a5 first, and then bishop to e7, and then castle. You can have a bit of fun with this position. Personally, I probably would recommend bishop d6 though, if you can remember it, because this looks a lot better for black than this position, I would argue. So that's that line covered. After knight takes, pawn takes, and c3, you play bishop to f5. If bishop d3 is played immediately, just take on d4. After knight to f3, attacking the queen. Bring the queen back to d6, I think, makes the most sense. After castles, bishop e7, rook e1. Can you go bishop e6? Whoa, what is this? And you can't take because of this. That is something else. Okay. After rook e6. Oh my god, what? Okay, probably don't take the knight then. Probably don't take the knight. I don't think anybody would ever play that, to be totally honest. I don't see that ever being played. I'm actually just going to check on the database to see if that has been played before. Queen d6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, bishop e6, knight d4. This has been played in one game ever, and it was between a 2750 and a 2630. So I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't think you need to worry about that. Hopefully I haven't started a new trend that is going to really harm Caro Kann players, because I like you guys. I'm one of you. Anyway. So after takes, let me just go back quickly. Bishop c4, you go bishop to d6. This bishop is far less dangerous on c4 than it is on d3, because h7 is a lot weaker than f7 is. So let's focus on this bishop c4 move. Queen e2 check, you go queen e7, we've already covered that. Knight f3, again, that's not well placed. Castles, rook e8, bishop g4, that is just very good for black. You know, castle, bishop g4, if your opponent plays h3, just step back. If g4, white is probably overextending a bit. You can do this as the white pieces, but I think black has some long-term advantages. After bishop c7, takes. White has to be very careful because a move like queen d6 is potentially pretty terrifying. And let's say that white plays something like c3 defending the pawn. Black is already better. White has to play f4 to block the diagonal off. Knight d7, probably rook e8 at some point. I would, obviously have black here any day of the week. White has to find the move king g2, and after queen d6, rook h1. Very, very strange thing to find. I have had a similar setup played against me in one over the board game. Not in this particular set of circumstances, but I set up this kind of battery, and my opponent played a king g2, rook h1 kind of line, not in this exact position. But I went on to win that game quite comfortably, so I don't think this is viable at all for the white pieces, although the computer will tell you that it's okay. I disagree. So yeah, don't worry about your bishop getting booted around. You're in no real danger there. Rook e1, just play your moves. Play knight to d7. The bishop can come back to c7 if, say, the knight moves out the way and you want to go queen to d6. Or you can go something like queen to c7 and rook to e8 and challenge for the e-file. This is the top line of the computer, just for reference. Push the bishop back, bishop g6, attacking the queen if you want. a5, you can always throw in to threaten to trap the bishop. But you're never going to be worse. You're never really going to be worse in this line for the black pieces, I don't think, because bishop c4, what are you threatening? The knight can never ever come to help the bishop out because of the pawn's placement. There's no dangerous pin on a knight on f6 because our pawn's on f6. And this queen will always struggle to do anything in an attacking sense, right? So, okay, something like knight to e2, castle, rook e8, c3. White can play in this manner so that the knight isn't vulnerable on f3 to bishop to g4 ideas. Again, this is fine. You can just challenge the opponent's bishop if you want. Trade the bishops off, that's perfectly valid. White could try and keep the bishop on the board with bishop to d3, and this might be a bit more of a testing line for white to play, to be fair, because white gets this bishop d3 set up, even if it means he has to set forward and then backwards. You can play queen to c7, threaten the h2 pawn, knight g6 to, sorry, knight g3 to block, or h3. Either works for white, really. But just continue playing, and what's nice about this is that because white spent so long stepping forwards and backwards, after queen c2 attacking the pawn, you don't have to play something like h5 or h6 or g6 like you normally do. You can play f5, which is worth noting, because bishop takes is not playable, because, whoops, your knight hangs. So you can play f5 if you want, and after f5 you can bring the knight into f6 and try and get some control over the e4 square. I'm actually going to leave this up to you, whether you go f5 or play the knight to f8 move, tucking the knight away and guarding the light squares on the king side. The knight can always come to g6 at a future point as well, and maybe get involved on the important f4 square. The f4 square is crucial in this opening, by the way. The f4 square, lots and lots gets fought over controlling the f4 square. I have won quite a few over the board games because I've just gained control over the f4 square. Very, very important. Anyway, I think I've covered the majority of lines possible after, let's see if my game allows it to load, after knight c3. Again, I want you to take f3. White can try and play in a gambity way. Other than that, white really has to take. After knight to f6, retreating the knight isn't that great. White most of the time takes. I will cover quickly before I end this video. And by the way, if you have any questions about anything I've covered, drop them in the comments below. I'll send you a reply. I'll reply to every comment on this video. Or I can make a follow-up video if I've missed something glaringly obvious. So I hope I haven't done that. Bishop d3. Defending the knight is a move here, but you can just take on d4, similar to the previous position after the knights get traded and then bishop d3 is played. I have actually seen queen to e2, was it? Or was it queen d3 that I've seen? Yeah, it's queen d3 that I've seen before, defending the knight. This just isn't that impressive. Just takes. The computer likes queen d5, just offering a trade. Not sure how I feel about that. Personally, I kind of like the idea of knight to d7, trying to come to f6. Bishop to e6 is also playable, stopping bishop to c4. And I suppose if something like knight to f3, then bishop to d5, queen f4, you can take, and then take on d4 if the queen takes, and if the pawn takes, then white's structure is just damaged. I think it really depends on whether you want to try to win or draw. If you want to draw, then just go queen to d5, nice and simple. Try and trade the queens off, and black can never be worse. If you want to go for a win, then I would either recommend bishop e6, trying to play bishop to d5. I don't think c4 is particularly concerning, although b5 is apparently the move here. And no, sorry, if takes, bishop to d5, queen e3, and e6. That's very complicated. So to be totally honest, c4 looks a bit, not scary, but a bit concerning. So I'd probably say, if you want to go for a draw, queen d5. If not, queen a5 is an interesting line. Bishop d2 can be met with bishop to f5, and if takes, then black is a little bit better. Just because both queens are under attack. After this, you can play this. Although you get some interesting positions. The queens will probably come off the board. Again, if you don't want the queens to come off the board, then you can go for this knight d7, knight to f6 plan. If you do, you can go for this complicated queen a5, bishop f5 stuff. Or you can just go queen d5. I wouldn't recommend bishop e6, it's pretty complicated, but if you want to study the lines in depth, then I would recommend doing that by yourself because they're rather complicated. And I don't know the lines well enough to totally say what's best to do, but this doesn't get played all that often. It doesn't get played very much at all. Normally, if white is going to do anything other than take, then he's going to retreat the knight to c3 or g3. g3 is bad because of h5, and c3 just isn't that impressive. Why are you putting the knight back there black can just develop very, very easily. Bishop f5, e6, bishop d6, castles, knight bd7, maybe queen c7. Dead easy position for black, lead in development. I'd argue black is a little bit better, although white has a bit more central space. Anyway, I think that's basically everything. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you get notified when my second video on this comes out. And please let me know in the comments again if I've missed anything and what series of moves you want me to cover in the second video, because I'm going to be doing this repertoire slash course bit by bit. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.